Katya, a second-year biology student, walked through the snow-covered forest edge, wrapped in an old down jacket she had inherited from her grandmother Olya. The winter was particularly harsh. The frost bit her cheeks, and the wind pierced her to the bone, howling in the bare branches of the trees. The trains weren't running because of the blizzard, and Katya had to walk straight through the forest to the highway to get to her rented apartment in the town by the Vyazemka River. It was getting dark. The sky above her head was heavy with gray clouds, and twilight was gathering, turning the forest into a mysterious labyrinth of shadows and snow. She quickened her pace, dreaming of hot mint tea in the warmth of a small room that smelled of books and lavender. Katya was not one to complain. She liked to study, observe nature, and write down the habits of birds and animals in her notebook, as her grandmother Olya had taught her. Katya, she would say, sitting on the porch of their old house in the village, nature is a book, and you must learn to read it with your heart. Her grandmother passed away 3 years ago, leaving Katya not only a down jacket, but also a love for living things, for those in need of help. This love guided her now, as she walked through the forest, tired after a long day of practice in the reserve, humming an old song under her breath so that she wouldn't be so afraid of being alone. Suddenly, at the edge of the forest, where the pines gave way to sparse bushes, something flashed in the snowdrift, a small red spot, almost indistinguishable in the whiteness of the snow. Katya stopped, squinted, and felt her heart skip a beat. She thought it might be a leaf or a piece of cloth, but there was something alive and fragile about this spot. She took a step closer, then another, and knelt down, raking the snow with the woolen mittens her grandmother had knitted for her. In the snowdrift lay a tiny lump, frozen, with barely noticeable movement of its chest. Katya gasped, her breath freezing in the frosty air. It was a newborn kitten, she thought, ginger, with wet, matted fur, closed eyes, and such weak breathing that she could barely hear it. "Who did this to you, little one?" Katya whispered, her voice trembling with pity. A lump in her throat prevented her from speaking, and anxiety mixed with determination grew in her chest. She remembered how her grandmother had rescued kittens found in the barn, how she had warmed them in an old scarf and fed them with a pipette. "Life clings to warmth, Katya," she used to say. "Give it warmth, and you will see a miracle." Katya carefully picked up the kitten, which was almost weightless, like a snowflake. Its body was cold, but she felt a faint movement. It was still fighting. She took off her mittens, wrapped the baby in their soft wool, and pressed it to her chest, hiding it under her down jacket. The warmth of her body seemed to give him strength, and Katya felt his heart beating softly, so fragile but alive. She stood in the middle of the forest, in the twilight, and felt how this tiny bundle was becoming her responsibility, her hope. "Hang in there, little one," she whispered. "We'll make it." The road home was long, the snow crunched under her boots, the wind threw stinging snowflakes in her face, but Katya walked on, holding the kitten close to her, as if protecting him from the whole world. She imagined how it would purr on her lap, like her grandmother's cat Vasya, who loved to sleep on her knitted sweater. The thought that the kitten might not survive was unbearable, and Katya pushed it away, focusing on the warmth of her hands and the rhythm of her steps. She remembered her grandmother's stories about how she found animals in trouble, a baby bird that had fallen out of its nest, a hedgehog stuck in a fence. "The heart always knows, Katya," she used to say, and Katya felt that her heart was now beating in unison with this tiny creature. Finally, she reached her home, an old 5-story building with peeling paint on the facade. Climbing to the 3rd floor, Katya opened the door to her small apartment, which smelled of books, dried lavender, and comfort. She carefully placed the kitten on the sofa, putting an old flannel shirt that smelled like home under it. She turned on the heater, filled a hot water bottle with warm water, and placed it next to the kitten so it wouldn't get cold. The kitten lay motionless, only its faint breathing indicating that it was still with her. Katya found a recipe for kitten milk formula on the internet, mixed warm milk with water, and filled a pipette she kept for lab work. She dripped the milk onto its tiny mouth, and to her delight, it licked it. Weakly, but eagerly. "Good boy, baby," Katya whispered, stroking his back with her finger. Her heart was beating faster, and her eyes stung with tears. She remembered how Grandma Olya used to sit with the kittens at night, teaching her patience and faith. "Life is fragile, Katya, but if you give it warmth, it will cling to it." Her words echoed, and Katya felt that she was doing just that. By nightfall, the kitten began to stir slightly. Katya made a nest for him out of an old sweater, placing a hot water bottle under the fabric to keep him warm. She massaged his tummy with a damp cotton ball, as advised on the internet, and he squeaked, a weak but lively sound that filled her with joy. She sat nearby, afraid to fall asleep, and looked at its red fur, which began to shine in the light of the table lamp. It seemed to her that its muzzle was slightly longer than that of ordinary kittens, and its ears were sharper, but she attributed this to fatigue and the dim light. Just a non-standard cat, she thought, smiling. Katya gave him a name, Rizhik. It was simple like her grandmother's fairy tales and warm like her embrace. She remembered how Olya called her cat Vasya because a name should have a soul. Rizhik was just like that. It promised warmth, like the sun on a winter day. Katya lay down on the sofa, placing her hand next to Rizhik's nest so she could feel his breath. In the silence of the apartment, with the wind howling outside the window, she whispered, "We're with you, Rizhik. You're not alone." She didn't know who this little one really was, but she felt that he had already become a part of her life. Hope grew in her heart like a small sprout under the snow, that this kitten, found in a snowdrift, would bring something special into her world. Katya closed her eyes, listening to Rizhik's faint squeak, and thought of her grandmother Olya, who would probably be smiling now, seeing her granddaughter saving a life. Katya woke up to a faint squeak coming from the nest on the sofa. The wind was still howling outside the window, but the apartment was warm, and the soft light of the table lamp illuminated Rizhik's red fur as he fidgeted in the sweater, trying to get out of the folds of fabric. Katya jumped up, her heart beating faster. He was alive. She carefully took him in her palm, feeling his tiny body tremble, but not as much as yesterday. His breathing had become more even, and his squeak a little louder, as if he were calling her, his savior. Katya smiled, remembering her grandmother Olya, who used to say, "Katya, the first sound is like the song of life. If he sings, it means he wants to live." She settled down on the sofa, propping herself up with a pillow, and began a new day of caring for Rizhik. The hot water bottle was still warm, but Katya refilled it with hot water so that the baby wouldn't get cold. She mixed a new batch of milk formula, following a recipe from the internet, and filled a pipette. Rizhik, sensing the smell of milk, turned his head slightly, and his tiny pink tongue licked a drop. Katya held her breath, afraid to spoil the moment. He sucked slowly but eagerly, and every drop he swallowed seemed like a small victory to her. "Good boy, my darling," she whispered, stroking his back with her finger. His fur, already dry, was soft as down, and Katya noticed that his red color had become brighter, like sparks in a fireplace. It seemed to her that his muzzle was slightly elongated, and his ears, although pressed against his head, were sharper than those of the kittens she had seen at her grandmother's house. But she dismissed the thought, deciding that it was just an unusual breed or the effects of the cold. "The main thing is that you're alive, Red," she thought, feeling warmth spreading through her chest. Katya remembered how Grandma Olya had taught her to care for kittens. Warmth, food, and affection. "That's what they need, Katya," she said, sitting by the stove, where the babies were warming themselves in an old scarf. Katya followed these words as if they were a commandment. After feeding him, she took a cotton pad, moistened with warm water, and gently massaged Rizhik's tummy to help him digest. He squeaked, twitching his paw, and Katya laughed. The sound was so lively, so real, that her heart filled with joy. She imagined how Rizhik would grow up, run around the apartment, catch sunbeams, and purr on her lap like Vasya, her grandmother's cat. The day passed in a flurry of activity. Katya fed Rizhik every 2 hours, changed his hot water bottle, stroked him, and whispered kind words to him. She cancelled all her plans, even skipping her lecture and writing to her professor that she was ill. It seemed to her that nothing was more important than this little one right now. By evening, Rizhik became more active. He tried to crawl around the nest, clinging to the sweater with his tiny claws. Katya made him a box with high sides, lining it with soft fabric so that he wouldn't fall. She put a hot water bottle and an old scarf that smelled of her perfume in there. She thought the familiar smell would calm the baby. At night, Katya slept fitfully, waking up at every squeak. She sat by the box looking at Rizhik and thought about how unfair the world was. Someone had thrown this little creature out into the snow, left it to die, but it had survived and found her. She remembered her grandmother's stories about animals that clung to life against all odds. "They are stronger than they seem, Katya," Olya said, "and we are their chance." Katya felt that she had become a chance for Rizhik, and it filled her with strength. By the morning of the second day, Rizhik had grown stronger. He was no longer just licking the milk, but sucking on the pipette, weakly moving his paws as if to help himself. Katya noticed that his thin, long tail trembled when he ate, and it touched her heart. She took a photo to capture the moment and sent it to her friend Masha, who loved cats. "Look at the kitten I saved," she wrote. Masha replied immediately, "Katya, he's so tiny, but his face is strange, not like a kitten's. Maybe he's a mixed breed?" Katya shrugged, deciding it didn't matter. The main thing was that he was alive and with her. She began to notice that Rizhik liked it when she talked to him. Her soft, warm voice calmed him, and he stopped squeaking, pressing himself against her finger. Katya told him about her life, about her lectures, about the nature reserve where she studied birds, about her grandmother Olya, who taught her to see beauty in small things. She would have liked you, Rizhik, she whispered. She would have said you were a fighter. These conversations were like a bridge between her and the baby, connecting them with an invisible thread. By the end of the week, Rizhik was already crawling confidently around the box, poking his nose into the fabric. His eyes were still closed, but Katya felt that he recognized her by her scent and voice. She sat with him in the evenings, reading a zoology textbook, and sometimes caught herself smiling as she watched him sleep with his paws tucked under him. It seemed to her that his muzzle was becoming more elongated and his ears more pointed, but she didn't think much of it. He's just a special cat, she thought, stroking him. One evening, when Rizhik fell asleep purring, or so she thought, Katya took a notebook and wrote, "Rizhik is my little hero. He chose life, and I chose him." She remembered her grandmother Olya, her smile, her words. "Katya, love is when you give without expecting anything in return." Katya felt that she already loved this little one, and it was like a light in the winter night. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she believed that Rizhik was the beginning of something special, like spring after a long winter. Katya sat on the floor in her small apartment, watching Rizhik, who was now 2 weeks old, clumsily crawling around in a box. His red fur was now shiny, and his paws, though weak, clung confidently to the fabric. He was no longer the fragile little ball she had found in the snowdrift, but something about him still worried Katya. She noticed how his muzzle was stretching out, and his ears, now raised, seemed sharper than those of the kittens she had seen in photographs. Katya stroked him, whispering, "You're my special kitty." But deep down, she had a growing feeling that Rizhik was not quite who she thought he was. One morning, when Katya was feeding him from a bottle, she had replaced the pipette with a small nipple she had bought at a pet store. Rizhik suddenly opened his eyes. Katya froze, staring into his eyes. Instead of blue, like a kitten's, his eyes were a rich yellow, with narrow vertical pupils, like a small predator. They sparkled like amber and looked at her with curiosity, as if studying her. Katya laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Well, Redhead, you really are unusual," she said, trying to shake off the strange feeling. She took several photos, capturing his eyes, long fluffy tail, and elongated muzzle. Rizhik, as if sensing that he was being watched, crawled closer and poked his nose into her palm, making a low, rumbling sound similar to a purr. Katya was touched, but something about the sound wasn't quite cat-like. It was deeper, sharper. She remembered her grandmother Olya, who used to say, "Katya, nature is full of surprises. Not everything is as it seems." Those words now rang in her head like a warning. Katya sent the photo to her friend Masha, who was studying to be a veterinarian and was always ready to give advice. "Look how Rizhik's eyes have opened. But there's something strange about him, isn't there?" she wrote, attaching the photos. Masha replied a few minutes later. "Katya, he's so cute. But is he definitely a kitten? He has a long tail and an elongated muzzle. Maybe he's a puppy, although he behaves like a cat." Katya frowned as she reread the message. "A puppy?" She looked at Rizhik, who had climbed onto her lap and started licking her finger like a kitten. No, he couldn't be a puppy. He purred, cuddled, and even tried to wash himself with his paw, albeit clumsily. But doubts clung to her thoughts like snowflakes to her eyelashes. Katya began to notice little things she had ignored before. Rizhik didn't just crawl. He moved with a certain cunning, as if sniffing something around him. His claws were sharper than those of kittens, and when he squeaked, the sound was higher and sharper than that of Vasya, her grandmother's cat. Katya decided to check her suspicions and opened her laptop, leafing through articles about kittens and puppies. But none of the photos matched Rizhik completely. He was too unusual. In the evening, when Rizhik fell asleep in the box, curled up in a ball, Katya sat at the table hugging a mug of tea. She remembered how Grandma Olya taught her to observe animals. "Look at the details, Katya," she said, showing her how to distinguish a sparrow from a titmouse. "Nature doesn't lie, but sometimes it hides the truth." Katya looked at the sleeping Rizhik and felt that he was a mystery she had to solve. She took a notebook and wrote, "Rizhik is my little secret. Kitten or not, he's mine." The next day, she noticed that Rizhik was trying to stand on his paws. He swayed but stubbornly moved toward the edge of the box, as if he wanted to explore the world. Katya picked him up, laughing, and put him on her shoulder. He immediately snuggled up to her neck, purring, and began to lick her ear. It was so touching that Katya almost cried. "Kitten or not, you're my Rizhik," she whispered, feeling him tremble from her warmth. But her doubts lingered. She decided to show a photo of Rizhik in her zoology class, where they were studying mammals. The teacher, an old professor with kind eyes, always encouraged students to ask questions. Katya waited for the end of the lecture, nervously fingering her notebook. She didn't want anyone to say that Rizhik wasn't a kitten. He was her baby, her miracle, rescued from a snowdrift. But something inside her told her that the truth was important, no matter how frightening it might be. In the evening, as she put Rizhik in his box, Katya noticed him reaching for a ray of sunlight that had broken through the curtain. He crawled toward it, poked his nose at it, and made the same purring sound that she had taken for purring. She laughed, but a feeling of excitement grew in her chest. "Who are you, Rizhik?" she thought, stroking him. She remembered her grandmother Olya's words. "Katya, don't be afraid of the truth. It always leads to something good." Katya didn't know what this truth would reveal, but she felt that Rizhik had already changed her life. He was her little hero, and she was ready to go further with him, even if he turned out to be not who he seemed to be. Katya sat in the lecture hall, fingering the edge of her notebook as the zoology lecture drew to a close. The ginger cat, left at home in its box, was constantly on her mind. His amber eyes with vertical pupils, long fluffy tail, and not quite cat-like purr disturbed her, but she still hoped that he was just an unusual kitten. She remembered her grandmother Olya, who used to say, Katya, the truth may surprise you, but it always sets you free. Today, Katya decided to find out the truth, even if it was frightening. When the professor finished his lecture, she approached him, clutching her phone with the photos of Rizhik. "Ivan Petrovich, can I show you something?" she asked, trying to speak calmly. The professor, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gray beard, nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Of course, Katya, what do you have?" he replied, and she opened the photo of Rizhik, his red fur, elongated muzzle, and pointed ears. The professor took the phone, looked closely, and froze. His eyebrows rose and his eyes widened in surprise. "Katya, where did you get it?" he asked, staring at the screen. She told him about finding it in a snowdrift, about how she had nursed the baby, thinking it was a kitten. The professor was silent as he leafed through the photos, then said quietly, "Katya, this is a fox cub." Katya laughed, thinking he was joking. A fox cub? In her apartment, purring and climbing on her shoulders? But Ivan Petrovich's face was serious. He invited her to the laboratory after class to check. Katya followed him, feeling her heart pounding. She imagined Rizhik sleeping in a box, his warm body against her chest, and couldn't believe that he was a wild animal. In the laboratory, the professor took out an old reference book on mammals and showed her a photo of a common fox cub. Katya looked at the picture, and her world shook. Red fur, long tail, pointed ears, elongated muzzle. Everything matched. Ivan Petrovich measured Rizhik's photo with a ruler and compared the proportions of the skull and tail. "Look," he said. "Even the claws and the shape of the ears. This is probably an orphaned fox cub. Maybe its mother died and it crawled out of the den." Katya was silent, feeling a lump in her throat that prevented her from speaking. She remembered how she found Rizhik in a snowdrift, how he trembled in her mittens, how he purred, pressing himself against her. A fox cub? It seemed impossible, but the truth stared back at her from the reference book. The professor suggested doing a DNA test to confirm, and Katya agreed, although deep down she already knew the answer. A few days later, the results came back. Rizhik was a fox cub, Vulpes vulpes, a common fox. In the evening, when she returned home, Katya sat down by the box where Rizhik was playing with a piece of cloth, dragging it with his paws. He looked at her with his yellow eyes, meowed, or was it not a meow, but a fox's squeak, and climbed onto her lap. Katya stroked him, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. He was so dear to her, so close. And the thought that he was not a kitten, but a wild creature, broke her heart. But in that broken heart, hope glimmered. "You're still my Rizhik," she whispered, hugging him close. She remembered her grandmother, Olya, who taught her to accept the world as it is. "Katya," she said, "nature makes no mistakes, but sometimes it gives us riddles. Solve them with love." Katya looked at Rizhik, who licked her hand and curled up into a ball, and realized that he was her riddle. She had saved him, thinking he was a kitten. But now she knew the truth, and that truth did not make him any less dear to her. She took her notebook and wrote, "Rizhik is a fox cub, but he is mine. I gave him life, and he gave me a miracle." Katya went to bed, leaving the box next to her bed. Rizhik slept, twitching his paws as if he were dreaming of a forest he had never known. She thought about what lay ahead for them. The professor had mentioned rehabilitation centers where the fox cub could live, but Katya was not ready to let him go. He trusted her, sought her warmth, and that was stronger than any truth. She remembered how Grandma Olya stroked her Katya, saying, "Love is when you give a home, even if it's temporary." Katya didn't know if her home would be temporary for Rizhik, but she felt that their story was just beginning. Katya smiled, but a heavy feeling grew in her chest. She knew that Rizhik was a fox cub, and this truth, discovered in the laboratory, changed everything. He slept with her on the sofa, licked her hands, purred, or was it a fox sound? But now she couldn't pretend that he was just her cat. Professor Ivan Petrovich was kind but straightforward. After the DNA test, he said, "Katya, he's a wild animal. He needs nature, not an apartment. There are rehabilitation centers where they will prepare him for life in the forest." Katya nodded, but every word was like a stab. Give up Rizhik? She remembered how she found him in a snowdrift, almost lifeless, how she warmed him to her chest, how he squeaked for the first time, clinging to life. He trusted only her, sought her warmth, and the thought of separation was unbearable. At home, Rizhik behaved like a real kitten. He climbed onto the windowsill, caught sunbeams, jumped onto the radiator, where he curled up into a ball. Katya laughed when he dragged her socks under the sofa or poked his nose into her textbook as if reading it. But now she noticed that his movements were not quite cat-like. He sniffed around corners, his ears twitched at every rustle, and his yellow eyes followed the birds outside the window with predatory attention. Katya stroked him, whispering, "You're my Rizhik." But deep down she struggled with the question, what was best for him? She remembered her grandmother Olya, who taught her to think not only about herself. "Katya," she said, stroking her cat Vasya, "love is when you give freedom, even if it hurts." Katya did not want freedom for Rizhik if it meant losing him, but she knew that foxes were not domestic animals. She had read articles and watched videos. Foxes in captivity could suffer. Their instincts demanded forests, hunting, and open spaces. But Rizhik, raised by her, did not know the forest. He knew only her voice, her hands, her apartment with flowered wallpaper. Katya decided to talk to Masha, her veterinarian friend. They met in a cafe, and Katya brought Rizhik in a carrier. He sat with his ears pressed back, but when he saw Katya, he poked his nose against the bars, letting out a quiet squeak. Masha gasped as she looked into his amber eyes. "Katya, he's incredible," she said. "But you understand that he won't stay this way. He'll grow up and become wild. You won't be able to keep him in your apartment." Katya lowered her eyes, stroking Rizhik through the bars. "I know," she whispered. "But how can I let him go?" Masha put her hand on her shoulder. "You saved his life. Now think about how to give him a future." These words echoed in Katya's mind, reminding her of her grandmother's lessons. She returned home, feeling her heart break. Rizhik jumped out of the carrier, jumped onto her lap, and began licking her chin. Katya cried, hugging him close. "You're my baby," she whispered, "but I want you to be happy." The next day, she began searching for information about rehabilitation centers. One of them, not far from the reserve where she was doing her internship, seemed suitable. There, they taught foxes to live in the wild, gradually accustoming them to the forest. But Katya couldn't imagine giving Rizhik away to strangers. She watched him play with a paper ball, climb onto her shoulder, purring, and thought, maybe I can prepare him myself. She remembered how Grandma Olya had released a healed hedgehog into the garden. "He'll come back if he wants to, Katya," she said. "But his home is where he is free." Katya didn't know if she could let Rizhik go, but she felt she had to try. She decided to start small, to accustom him to the world outside the window, to the smells of grass, to the sounds of the forest. She bought a harness to take him for walks and began reading about the behavior of foxes. Every word about their instincts, about life in nature, was like a step towards separation. But Katya saw in it love, real love, the kind her grandmother had talked about. In the evening, as she put Rizhik to bed, Katya looked at his sleeping face. He twitched his paws as if he were running in his sleep through a forest he had never seen. She took a notebook and wrote, "Rizhik is my little fox, but his heart is in the forest. I will teach him to be free, even if it breaks mine." She remembered her grandmother's words. Love is not holding on, but giving wings. Katya didn't know if she had the strength, but she felt that Rizhik deserved a chance to live as nature intended. And she was ready to be his guide, even if it meant saying goodbye. Spring was timidly breaking through winter, and the air smelled of damp earth and hope. Rizhik, an already grown fox cub with a fluffy tail and bright yellow eyes, sat at her feet, poking his nose into her boot. He had grown over the months, becoming agile and curious, but he still sought her warmth, lying down next to her on the sofa and purring, or rather making that fox sound that Katya loved so much. She stroked him, feeling her heart tighten with love and anxiety. The decision she made was difficult, but right. She would prepare Rizhik for life in the wild. Katya remembered her grandmother Olya's words. Katya, sometimes love means letting go to give life. These words became her guiding light. She couldn't give Rizhik to a rehabilitation center without trying to teach him to be free herself. He trusted her, and she wanted his return to the forest to be gentle and full of care. She started small. She bought a bright orange harness so she could see him in the grass, and took a backpack for Rizhik to climb into when he got tired. Their first walk was in a park near her home, where old oak trees grew and the air smelled of moss. Once on the grass, Rizhik first pressed himself against Katya's legs, his ears trembling at every rustle. She sat next to him, whispering, "Don't be afraid, baby. This is your world." He sniffed the ground, touched a leaf with his paw, and then, emboldened, took his first leap toward a bush. Katya laughed as she watched him bury his nose in the grass, but her heart ached. He was already reaching out to nature, which was his home. She remembered how her grandmother had released a healed baby bird into the garden, saying, "Its wings know where to fly." Every day they walked a little longer. Katya taught Rizhik to hide in the bushes, sniff out tracks, and react to sounds. She read books about foxes, learning how they hunt and dig burrows. Rizhik learned quickly. He was already catching beetles, chasing butterflies, and once brought her a feather, holding it proudly in his teeth. Katya praised him, but felt time slipping away. He was becoming stronger, more independent, and that was both her victory and her pain. One day she took him to the forest, to the very edge where she had found him in the snowdrift. Rizhik jumped out of the backpack, sniffing the air, and suddenly froze, looking into the thicket. His tail trembled, his eyes sparkled, as if he had heard a call. Katya sat down on a fallen tree, watching him run between the pines, dig the ground with his paws, and jump after a bird's shadow. He would return to her, nudging her knees with his nose, but each time he would go a little further away. She remembered her grandmother's words. "Katya, nature calls its children. You just help them answer." Katya began to let him off the leash, giving him freedom. At first he was afraid, clinging to her, but after a month he was already disappearing into the bushes, returning with leaves in his fur or feathers in his teeth. She taught him to look for food, hiding pieces of meat in the grass. And he found them, wagging his tail. Katya was proud of him, but every step he took into the forest was a step toward separation. She cried at night, holding him close while he slept, but she knew she was doing it for his sake. One day, Masha, a veterinarian friend, came to visit and saw Rizhik playing with Katya on the balcony, catching a paper ball. "Katya, you're doing the impossible," she said. "He's almost ready for the forest. You've given him everything." Katya nodded, but tears burned her eyes. She didn't want him to be ready. She wanted him to remain her Rizhik, the little fox who purred on her lap. But she remembered her grandmother Olya, her smile when she let the animals go. "Love is their happiness, Katya, not yours." Katya took a notebook and wrote, "Rizhik is learning to be a fox, and I am learning to let go. He will be free because I love him." She looked at him sleeping on the sofa, his paws twitching as if he were running through the forest in his dreams. She knew that the day would soon come when he would leave forever, but every moment with him was precious. She whispered, "You are my hero, Rizhik. You showed me what it means to truly love." Katya stood at the edge of the forest where, almost 4 months ago, she had found Rizhik in a snowdrift. Spring was now in full swing. The grass was green, the pine trees smelled of resin, and birds sang in the branches. Rizhik, a grown-up fox cub with shiny red fur and a fluffy tail, sat at her feet, sniffing the air. His yellow eyes sparkled, his ears caught every sound, and Katya saw him reaching for the forest that had become his home. She held the empty backpack in which she had once carried him on walks and felt her heart torn between pride and pain. Today was the day she had taught him to be free. Rizhik was no longer the little baby who used to tremble in her mittens. He caught mice, hid in the bushes, dug burrows under the trees. Katya saw him running through the forest, freezing to sniff out a trail, jumping after a butterfly with an ease that was not possible in her apartment. He returned to her on walks, but each time he went further and further away. She knew he was ready, and that knowledge was her victory and her farewell. She remembered her grandmother Olya, her words. "Katya, love is giving them wings, even if they fly away." Katya sat down on the grass, and Rizhik immediately ran up, poking his nose into her palm. He licked her fingers, making that familiar fox sound that she had once mistaken for purring. Katya smiled, but tears ran down her cheeks. "You've grown up, my boy," she whispered, stroking him. Rizhik looked at her, his eyes as bright as they had been on the day he first opened them. She remembered thinking he was a kitten, nursing him sleeping on her chest. Now he was a fox, a real wild one, and he was her miracle. She took a piece of meat he loved out of her pocket and hid it in the grass, as she had done during training. Rizhik immediately rushed to look for it, wagging his tail, and found the treat, returning to her proudly. Katya laughed, wiping away her tears. "You're a good boy," she said, and he nudged her knees with his muzzle, as if to thank her. She knew it was their last day together and wanted to remember every moment, his soft fur, his scent, his gaze. Katya stood up, looking into the thicket. "Go, Rizhik," she said quietly, removing his orange harness. He froze, looking at her as if he understood. Then he took a step toward the forest, but stopped and turned around. Katya felt a lump in her throat that made it hard to breathe. She remembered her grandmother's smile when she let the hedgehog go into the garden. "His home is there, Katya." She nodded to Rizhik, whispering, "Your home is there, baby." He ran up to her, rubbed against her legs like a kitten, and Katya cried, crouching down to hug him one last time. Rizhik licked her cheek, then turned toward the forest. He took a few steps, his tail flashing in the grass, and disappeared into the bushes. Katya stood listening to the rustling of the leaves, hoping he would return. But the forest was silent and she knew he was gone. She sat down on the ground, hugging her knees, and cried. But her tears contained not only pain, but also quiet happiness. She had given him life, taught him to be a fox, and now he was free. Katya remembered how Grandma Olya used to say, "Katya, they always leave a mark on your heart." Rizhik left a mark, not only on her heart, but also on her life. She learned to love in a way she had never known before, not to hold on, but to let go, not to fear pain, but to see meaning in it. She took the notebook she had brought with her and wrote, "Rizhik has gone into the forest, but he will always be mine. I gave him freedom, and he gave me love." Returning home, Katya felt the forest seeing her off with the rustle of the wind. She knew that Rizhik was now where he belonged, and that filled her with pride. At home, in her empty apartment, she looked at the box where he had slept, at the harness that smelled of grass, and smiled. Rizhik was her miracle, her lesson, her little fox who taught her that love is not the end, but the beginning. She whispered into the silence, "Be happy, my Rizhik. I will always be with you."